The newly built Salem County morgue stood like a stark modern monolith beside the ancient Pine Grove Cemetery, a place where history seemed to cling to every crooked tombstone. The cemetery had existed for over 2 centuries, its weathered gravestones covered in moss, bearing names long forgotten. The juxtaposition of the sleek morgue against the decaying cemetery had sparked unease among some of the locals. But to the team working there, it was just another job. Emily Carter, the chief pathologist, saw it as nothing more than a facility to process the dead efficiently. Emily was a pragmatic woman, in her mid-30s, with sharp eyes and a reputation for maintaining her composure under the most stressful of circumstances. She had seen death in every possible form. But on this particular evening, as she walked the sterile, brightly lit corridors of the morgue, a strange sensation prickled at her skin, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. It was quiet, too quiet, even for a morgue. The first sign that something was wrong came as she passed by the row of cold chambers where bodies were stored. At first, she heard only the faint hum of the cooling units. But then, just beneath the mechanical drone, there was something else. A murmur. It was so soft that she thought her ears were playing tricks on her. She paused, leaning in slightly to the cool metal of the chamber doors. The murmur came again, this time clearer, a sound like a breath, followed by what could only be described as a faint whisper. She pulled back sharply, her heart beginning to race. The morgue was supposed to be silent. She quickly scanned the room, expecting to see one of her colleagues, but she was alone. The sterile lights cast long shadows along the walls, flickering momentarily, but then settling back into their harsh glow. Emily shook her head, telling herself it was nothing more than the ventilation system playing tricks on her tired mind. But as she stepped away, there was a distinct sound, a faint but unmistakable voice, almost as if it had come from inside the storage unit. Emily. The word was clear, yet distant, like it had traveled through layers of thick fog. She froze. The logical part of her brain struggled to make sense of what she had heard. Was it someone from the outside? A trick of acoustics? She cautiously approached the stainless steel door of the chamber, where the sound seemed to have originated. Her breath caught as she slowly pulled the handle. The door opened with a soft hiss, releasing a burst of icy air. Inside, the body of an elderly man lay motionless, a recent intake. His skin was pale, a thin layer of frost forming along his exposed arms. Emily stared at him for a moment, feeling a deepening sense of unease. She half expected him to move, to sit up and say her name again, but the body remained still, lifeless. "Get it together, Emily," she whispered to herself, quickly closing the door. But as she stepped back, the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further, and a shadow moved across the far wall, slow, deliberate, and entirely out of place. The figure was shapeless, like smoke or mist, but it was there, shifting at the corner of her vision. Her heart pounded in her chest, but when she turned to confront the shadow, it dissolved into the cold, sterile air. The room was silent once more, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigeration units. Emily stood there for a long moment, her breath visible in the suddenly freezing room, her mind racing to explain the inexplicable. With trembling hands, she checked the thermostat. The temperature was normal, but nothing about what she had just experienced felt normal. She backed out of the morgue room, her senses on high alert. As the door closed behind her with a metallic click, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Something was there with her, watching, whispering. Thomas Dawson had always been a man of science. As the morgue's senior technician, he prided himself on his ability to remain calm in the face of the grotesque and unexplainable. The dead, in his mind, were nothing more than lifeless vessels, bodies that no longer held any trace of the souls that once animated them. For years, he had scoffed at the supernatural, brushing off ghost stories as fabrications of the overimaginative. But that night, something changed. It was just past midnight when Thomas found himself alone in the storage room. Emily had left early, her face pale and drawn, muttering something about needing rest. The atmosphere in the morgue was heavier than usual, as if the very air had thickened. The hum of the cooling units was steady, almost comforting, as Thomas worked his way through routine maintenance checks. He adjusted his glasses and methodically noted the temperature levels on each storage unit, satisfied that everything was in order. But then, as he reached the last cold chamber, a faint tapping caught his attention. His hand paused midair, hovering over the clipboard. The tapping came again, louder this time, an erratic rhythmic knock. He slowly turned toward the source, his eyes narrowing in confusion. It was coming from one of the storage units, the same type of metal drawer he had opened hundreds of times without a second thought. Tap, tap, tap. His breath caught in his throat. It was impossible for anything alive to be inside one of those chambers. Each drawer contained a cadaver, bodies frozen in death, their organs cold, their hearts silent. Yet the knocking continued, insistent, like someone trapped, pleading for release. Thomas's first instinct was to ignore it, to write it off as a quirk of the building, a vibration, a faulty hinge, anything to avoid the terrifying possibility his mind was now presenting. But the sound persisted, growing louder, more deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was inside was becoming desperate. He could no longer pretend it wasn't happening. With his pulse racing, he approached the unit and glanced at the small clipboard attached to the drawer. Inside was the body of an elderly man who had died that morning. A routine case, no foul play involved. Thomas hesitated, his hand resting on the cold steel handle, his rational mind screaming at him to leave it alone. But his curiosity, the need to confront whatever was happening, overpowered his fear. Slowly, he pulled the drawer open. A rush of frigid air hit his face, sending a shiver down his spine. The body lay before him, perfectly still, eyes closed, lips pale and blue. Everything appeared as it should. Thomas exhaled in relief, feeling slightly foolish for letting his nerves get the best of him. He began to close the drawer, but before it could seal shut, the knocking returned. Louder now, more insistent. His blood turned to ice. With trembling hands, he stepped back and stared at the frost-covered window on the door of the chamber. His breath fogged the glass as he leaned closer, trying to find a rational explanation. And then he saw it, a mark, faint but unmistakable. Pressed against the inside of the window was the clear outline of a hand. It was smudged as if it had been dragged across the icy surface from the inside. Thomas stumbled back, his chest tightening in panic. The handprint was too fresh, too defined to be an old mark, and there was no logical way it could have appeared. His mind raced as he tried to rationalize what he was seeing, but there was no explanation that made sense. Slowly, the handprint began to fade, the frost reclaiming the space where it had been, erasing any trace of what he had just witnessed. A cold sweat broke out across his brow. He wanted to run, to leave the morgue and never look back, but something kept him rooted in place. He found himself reaching for his phone, hands shaking as he dialed Emily. She picked up on the second ring, her voice tired but concerned. "Thomas? What's wrong?" I think you need to come back here," he stammered, his eyes glued to the now empty glass. "Something's happening." "What do you mean? What happened?" Her voice was sharper now, her exhaustion replaced by urgency. He hesitated, unsure of how to explain the inexplicable. "I heard knocking from inside one of the chambers, and I saw a handprint. It was inside the drawer, Emily." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Emily spoke again, her voice quiet, but filled with a creeping dread. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't open anything else. Just stay put." Thomas hung up, his fingers numb from the cold that seemed to permeate the room. He couldn't stop staring at the door of the chamber, waiting for something else to happen, half expecting the corpse to rise from the dead and press its face against the glass. But the knocking had stopped, and the morgue had returned to its eerie, oppressive silence. Trying to calm himself, Thomas busied himself with the maintenance tasks, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the scene over and over. Just as he began to convince himself that he had imagined it all, the lights flickered. The temperature dropped even further, and the unmistakable sound of knocking echoed through the room once more, this time from multiple chambers. The rhythmic tapping grew louder, more frenzied, as if the dead were all trying to escape at once. His breath caught in his throat, and he backed away from the rows of cold chambers. The shadows seemed to lengthen, and for the first time in his career, Thomas Dawson felt true, unbridled terror. He stumbled toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest, desperate to escape the oppressive cold, the whispers that were growing louder in his ears. As he reached for the exit, a final knock, deafening and deliberate, reverberated through the room. The power cut out, plunging him into pitch-black darkness. In the silence that followed, the whispers began again, this time unmistakably clear. Thomas. Rachel Collins had always been a light sleeper, prone to vivid dreams that often blurred the line between reality and fantasy. But since she had started working at the Salem County morgue, her dreams had taken a darker turn. Nightmares that seemed to claw at the edges of her consciousness, leaving her breathless and terrified each morning. In the beginning, she chalked it up to stress. After all, working with the dead wasn't exactly easy on the mind. But over the past few weeks, the nightmares had become relentless, almost as if something from her waking life was seeping into her subconscious, dragging her into a place she didn't want to go. That night, after her shift, Rachel collapsed in a bed, exhausted from the long hours and the strange occurrences at the morgue. She drifted off quickly, her body heavy with fatigue. But as soon as her mind slipped into sleep, the nightmare began, more vivid than ever before. She was in the morgue, lying flat on the cold steel autopsy table. The familiar fluorescent lights above flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Her limbs were frozen, paralyzed, as if some invisible force had locked her in place. She tried to move, to scream, but her mouth wouldn't open, her body refusing to respond to her desperate commands. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Figures, draped in black robes, faces obscured by hoods, circled the table. They whispered among themselves in voices too low for her to understand, their words blending together into a soft, sinister hum. Their hands moved with methodical precision, gloved fingers brushing over the instruments on the tray beside her. The cold steel of a scalpel glinted in the faint light as one of the robed figures lifted it, bringing it close to her skin. She could feel it, every touch, every slight pressure of the blade against her flesh. The sharp sting of the incision was excruciating, but no sound escaped her lips. The pain was real, far too real for a dream. Her chest tightened with panic as she watched, helpless, as they continued their silent, ritualistic procedure. The figures didn't speak to her, didn't acknowledge her terror. They worked in eerie unison, like surgeons performing an autopsy on a body that still had life within it. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to echo from all directions, bouncing off the cold walls of the morgue, filling her mind with an overwhelming sense of dread. As the blade carved deeper, she felt something shift inside her, not just physically, but emotionally, as if a part of her soul was being drawn out, slowly peeled away with each stroke of the scalpel. Then, without warning, one of the robed figures leaned down, its hooded face inches from hers. For the first time, she saw what lay beneath the hood, a skull, half decayed, with hollow, black eyes staring straight into her. Its jaw unhinged, and a voice, raspy and ancient, whispered directly into her ear. "You're next." Rachel jolted awake, her body drenched in sweat, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The oppressive weight of the dream still clung to her, a suffocating presence that made it hard to breathe. She sat up, gasping for air, her mind reeling from the vividness of what she had just experienced. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone to check the time. 3:33 a.m. The number sent a shiver down her spine. There was something unsettling about the symmetry of it, something that made her feel like she had crossed a threshold into a world that didn't belong to her. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just a coincidence, but the dread gnawing at the edges of her mind refused to leave. The room was colder than it should have been. She glanced toward the window, half expecting it to be open, but it was tightly shut. Still, the chill lingered, as if something unseen was breathing in the air around her, watching her. She pulled the blankets tighter around herself, But the feeling of being observed didn't go away. The nightmares were getting worse. They weren't just dreams anymore. They felt like invasions, as if something was creeping into her mind, using her sleep as a gateway. She had tried to tell Emily about them a few days ago, but Emily had brushed it off, too consumed by her own growing sense of unease. But Rachel knew something was wrong. The dreams weren't just figments of her imagination. They were warnings. The next morning, Rachel arrived at the morgue, feeling the weight of the sleepless night dragging her down. She hadn't mentioned the dream to anyone. How could she? It sounded absurd, like the kind of nightmare you'd expect from watching too many horror movies. But as soon as she stepped through the doors, the cold, sterile air hit her, and a wave of nausea swept over her. The whispers started again. She wasn't imagining them. They were faint, almost imperceptible beneath the usual hum of the morgue's machines. But they were there, lurking at the edges of her consciousness. Words she couldn't make out, voices that didn't belong to the living. They seemed to follow her as she walked through the morgue, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. By the time she reached the autopsy room, her hands were shaking. The body of a man in his 40s lay on the table, waiting for the procedure to begin. As she prepared the instruments, the familiar metallic scent of the morgue filled her nostrils. But there was something else underneath it now. Something rotten, decayed, like the earth itself was exhaling its last breath. Rachel glanced around the room, her eyes darting to the corners where the shadows gathered. She knew she wasn't alone. She could feel them watching her, waiting, just like in the dream. And when she looked up at the mirror on the far wall, she saw it, something shifting just behind her reflection. It was subtle at first, just a ripple in the glass, but then a shadow moved, dark and twisted, mimicking her every move. She turned quickly, her breath catching in her throat, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, but when she looked back at the mirror, the shadow was still there, standing behind her, its hollow eyes staring directly into hers. The days at the Salem County morgue began to bleed into one another, the sterile monotony masking the growing tension among the staff. Emily had returned to work after the unsettling phone call from Thomas, but something had shifted in the atmosphere since that night. The morgue no longer felt like just a workplace. There was a strange energy now, a coldness that clung to the walls, an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on everyone who stepped through the doors. Thomas had stopped talking about the knocking in the cold chambers, choosing instead to keep his head down and focus on his tasks. But the silence between the teams spoke louder than words. Emily, Thomas, and Rachel were all experiencing something beyond their understanding, yet none of them dared to fully acknowledge it. Rachel's nightmares continued to plague her. Each night, she would wake up in a cold sweat, the whispers from her dreams still echoing in her mind. She would hear them even after waking, faint but persistent, like ghostly remnants clinging to the edges of her reality. Each night, the same robed figures hovered over her, whispering in an ancient, indecipherable language, performing their dark ritual on her motionless body. And every night, one figure, its decayed face barely visible under the hood, would lean in close, its skeletal mouth forming words she understood perfectly. "You're next." On this particular morning, Rachel arrived early, hoping to shake off the remnants of the nightmare by burying herself in work. The morgue was empty, the lights dim, casting long, eerie shadows down the hallways. She made her way to the storage room where the bodies were kept, trying to convince herself that the whispers from the previous night had been a product of her exhausted mind. But as she approached the cold chambers, a sudden chill crawled up her spine. The air was colder than usual, biting at her skin even through her thick lab coat. She frowned, checking the thermostat. It read a normal temperature, but the cold was undeniable. The whispers, faint but unmistakable, began to stir again. They rose from the walls, from the very air around her, wrapping themselves around her like a shroud. Rachel froze, her breath catching in her throat. This wasn't just her imagination anymore. She could hear them, low, guttural murmurs, as if they were coming from deep within the walls of the morgue. She glanced nervously at the cold chambers, each drawer sealed tight. But something told her that whatever was making those sounds wasn't behind a door. It was all around her. She turned on her heel, heart pounding, and made her way to the autopsy room, hoping the clinical environment of the lab would give her some sense of normalcy. As she entered, the lights flickered momentarily before stabilizing, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the room. The steel instruments gleamed on the tray beside the body that awaited her attention. Today's case was a middle-aged woman, cause of death still undetermined. Rachel's hands were steady as she prepared her tools, but her mind was elsewhere. The whispers had followed her. No matter how much she tried to block them out, they continued, growing louder, more insistent. Her fingers hovered over the body, trembling slightly as the voices swelled, filling the room with their ghostly chorus. She could almost make out the words now, something about her name, a beckoning, a pull from the other side. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the lights flickered again, this time more violently. Rachel stumbled back, her breath visible in the freezing air. The lights cut out completely, plunging the room into darkness. The only sound was her own ragged breathing, mingling with the ever-present whispers that surrounded her. Rachel fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking as she turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the still form of the body on the table. But something was wrong. The body wasn't lying flat anymore. It was sitting up. Rachel's heart nearly stopped. She backed away, her mind screaming that it was impossible. The woman on the table had been dead for hours. This couldn't be happening. And yet, there she was, her head slightly tilted, empty eyes staring straight ahead. The whispers grew louder, swelling into a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate, more malevolent than the last. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing down on Rachel's chest, making it hard to breathe. She stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of instruments in her panic. The clattering sound echoed in the darkness, but the dead woman didn't move, didn't react. Rachel's phone flickered, and for a brief moment, the flashlight sputtered out. When it came back on, the woman's eyes were fixed directly on Rachel, her mouth slightly open, as if about to speak. Rachel! The voice wasn't human. It was a low, raspy hiss, like something ancient and withered. It came not from the dead woman's mouth, but from all around her, filling the room like a poisonous fog. Rachel couldn't move. Her body was frozen in place, terror rooting her to the spot. The dead woman's mouth began to open wider, impossibly wide, stretching far beyond the limits of human anatomy. A cold, black mist seeped out from her throat, curling around the edges of the table like smoke. And then the whispers stopped. Silence descended, thick and suffocating. Rachel's pulse hammered in her ears as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The woman's body collapsed back onto the table with a sickening thud, the black mist dissolving into the air as if it had never been there. The lights flickered back on. Rachel stood there, her heart racing, her mind struggling to process the nightmare unfolding in front of her. The room looked the same as it had before the lights went out, except for one thing, the body. The woman lay still on the table, just as she had been before. But her eyes were wide open now, locked in a permanent stare, and her lips were twisted into a grotesque smile. Rachel stumbled out of the room, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She could still hear the whispers faintly in the back of her mind, echoing through her thoughts. She wasn't safe here. None of them were. Something was happening in the morgue, something far beyond the physical world. And whatever it was coming for her next. Rachel didn't speak to anyone for the rest of her shift. She couldn't. Her mind was unraveling, and the horror of what she had just experienced in the autopsy room clung to her like a shroud. She avoided eye contact with Emily and Thomas, moving through the morgue like a ghost herself, her thoughts racing as she tried to make sense of what she had seen. How could the body have moved? And the whispers, the voice calling her name. What did it want from her? The hours crawled by, each minute feeling like an eternity, until finally, the end of her shift arrived. Rachel couldn't get out of there fast enough. As she stepped into the parking lot, the cold night air hit her like a slap, but it did nothing to ease the tension in her chest. She glanced around, half expecting to see shadows moving in the distance, watching her. But the lot was empty, save for a few parked cars and the faint hum of a nearby streetlight. Her hands shook as she fumbled with her keys, and she quickly slid into her car, locking the doors as if that thin layer of metal and glass could protect her from whatever was haunting the morgue. The drive home was a blur, her thoughts replaying the moment the body had sat up, the woman's lifeless eyes fixating on her, the black mist seeping from her mouth. No matter how much she tried to rationalize it, Rachel knew deep down that what she had witnessed wasn't a trick of the light or the result of an overworked mind. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. When she finally reached her small apartment, she felt no sense of relief. The shadows seemed to cling to her, as if she had brought a piece of the morgue back with her. She locked the door behind her, double-checking it for good measure, and headed straight for the bathroom, desperate to wash the day off her skin. As the hot water poured over her, she closed her eyes, trying to shake the feeling that she was being watched. But the whispers followed her. At first, they were faint, barely noticeable over the sound of the shower. But as she stood there, letting the water cascade over her, they grew louder. Rachel's eyes snapped open, her heart racing. She looked around the small bathroom, half expecting to see one of the robed figures from her nightmares standing behind her. But the room was empty, just steam rising from the hot water. She stepped out of the shower, her hands trembling as she reached for a towel. The whispers seemed to pulse with the beating of her heart, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. Rachel. The voice was clear now, unmistakable, rasping like dry leaves in the wind. It was coming from behind her. Slowly, almost against her will, Rachel turned to face the mirror. The glass was fogged from the steam, but as she stared at her reflection, something began to emerge. It started as a faint smudge, a dark shadow creeping through the mist. Her breath hitched in her throat as the figure took shape. A hooded figure, just like in her nightmares, standing behind her, its skeletal face barely visible beneath the hood. Its hollow eyes seemed to stare straight through her, black and empty. Her hand shot out to wipe the mirror clean, but the figure didn't disappear. It remained, looming over her shoulder, its decayed mouth opening as if to speak. Rachel stumbled back, her heart slamming in her chest. But when she looked behind her, the bathroom was empty. The figure existed only in the reflection. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice echoing through the small apartment. She felt like she was losing her mind. The figure remained in the mirror for what felt like an eternity before it slowly began to fade, dissolving back into the fog. Rachel backed away from the bathroom, her breathing ragged, her body shaking with fear. She couldn't stay here. Whatever was haunting her wasn't bound to the morgue. It had followed her home, latching onto her like a parasite. She grabbed her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed Emily's number. It rang once, twice, and then Emily's voice came through, sounding groggy. "Rachel? It's late. What's wrong?" I need to talk to you," Rachel stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't stay here. Something's happening. I think I'm losing it." "Slow down," Emily said, her tone shifting from groggy to concerned. "What do you mean? What's happening?" Rachel hesitated. How could she explain it without sounding insane? "It's the morgue," she finally said, her voice trembling. There's something wrong with that place, Emily. The whispers, the things I'm seeing, they're real. It's not just in my head." Emily was silent for a moment. "I've been hearing them too," she admitted quietly. "I thought it was just me, but there's something going on there. Thomas, he's been acting weird too. He won't talk about it, but I can tell it's getting to him." Rachel's heart sank. She wasn't alone in this, but that didn't make her feel any better. If anything, it made things worse. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just her. It was spreading, creeping into their minds, their lives. "I don't know what to do," Rachel whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't stay here tonight. I can still hear them, Emily. The whispers, they won't stop." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Come to my place," Emily said finally. "We'll figure this out together. You don't have to go through this alone." Rachel felt a small flicker of relief at the offer. She quickly packed an overnight bag, her hands still trembling as she threw clothes into it haphazardly. The whispers had quieted for the moment, but she knew they were still there, waiting just beyond the edges of her perception, ready to creep back in as soon as she let her guard down. As she locked up her apartment and headed out into the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting and stretching across the pavement like they had a life of their own. Rachel quickened her pace, her pulse racing, desperate to reach Emily's place and escape the suffocating dread that clung to her like a second skin. But as she drove through the dark, empty streets, she couldn't shake the sense that whatever was haunting her wasn't something she could outrun. The whispers weren't bound to a place or time. They were inside her now, whispering secrets from the other side, pulling her deeper into their cold embrace. And as she sped through the night, Rachel realized something with chilling clarity. She wasn't just a victim of the morgue's malevolence. She was becoming a part of it. Rachel's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she navigated the darkened streets toward Emily's apartment. Her heart raced, the echoes of the whispers still clinging to her mind like an unwanted parasite. The night outside seemed to press in on her from all sides, suffocating, the darkness more oppressive than usual. Streetlights flickered as she passed, casting brief, ghostly illuminations on the empty road, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each mile. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the robed figure sitting in the back seat. But it wasn't there, at least not yet. The blackened shadows seemed to crawl in her peripheral vision, though darting just out of sight every time she tried to focus on them. It wasn't her imagination. She knew something was following her. The whispers were quieter now, but they lingered just beneath the surface, like distant voices carried by the wind, waiting for the right moment to resurface. After what felt like an eternity, she finally pulled into the parking lot of Emily's apartment complex. The area was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of Rachel's neck stand on end. She shut off the car and sat there for a moment, her breath fogging up the windshield. For the first time in hours, she felt a strange sense of hesitation. Leaving the relative safety of her car, even with its fragile barrier, felt dangerous, as though stepping outside would make her vulnerable to whatever was lurking in the shadows. But she couldn't stay in the car all night. Summoning what little courage she had left, Rachel grabbed her bag and got out, glancing nervously around the lot. She could feel the darkness watching her, stalking her with every step she took toward Emily's building. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her heart hammering in her chest. The whispers started again, faint but unmistakable, swirling around her, twisting her name into something sinister. Rachel! Her legs felt weak as she hurried to the door, her body acting on pure instinct. She knocked rapidly, her knuckles hitting the wood in quick succession. A moment later, the door swung open, and Emily stood there, her face pale but relieved. "Come in quick," Emily urged, glancing nervously over Rachel's shoulder as if expecting to see something following her too. Rachel stumbled inside, the warmth of the apartment wrapping around her, but it did little to ease the chill in her bones. Emily closed the door quickly, locking it behind them with a sense of urgency. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Rachel shook her head, dropping her bag onto the floor. "I'm not sure," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't think we're safe. Not here, not anywhere. They followed me, Emily. I could feel them. The whispers. They're inside my head." Emily's eyes widened, and for the first time, Rachel saw the fear in her friend's expression, the same fear that had been haunting her. It was real. They were both being hunted by something that defied logic, something ancient and malevolent. "I've been hearing them too," Emily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "At first I thought it was just stress, but it's getting worse. I wake up in the middle of the night, and they're there in the walls, in the air. It's like they're trying to get into my head." Rachel sat down on Emily's couch, her body feeling heavy with exhaustion. "It's not just whispers anymore," she said, her voice shaking. "I saw something back at the morgue. It looked like one of those figures from my nightmares. It was there in the mirror, and the body, it moved." Emily's face paled even more. "The body moved?" she repeated in disbelief. Rachel nodded, her eyes wide and haunted. I swear it was sitting up, staring at me, and then it collapsed back onto the table like nothing had happened. But the way it looked at me, Emily, it was like it knew me. And the whispers, they were louder, stronger. Something is trying to break through. The room fell into an oppressive silence, both women grappling with the terrifying reality of what they were facing. Emily sat down next to Rachel, her hand trembling as she reached for her phone. "We need to figure out what's going on," Emily said, her voice steady but tinged with fear. "It's not just us. I've been doing some research, and there have been rumors about the cemetery near the morgue for years, about strange happenings, unexplained deaths, people going missing." Rachel's eyes widened. "What kind of rumors?" "Apparently, the land the cemetery was built on used to be part of a much older burial ground," Emily explained, scrolling through her phone. "A burial ground for criminals, outcasts, people who were never given proper burials, whose souls were never at rest. And when the city expanded, they built over it. The Necropolis has always had a dark history, but people just chalked it up to urban legends." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. "You think that's what's causing this? The spirits from the old burial ground?" Emily hesitated before nodding. "I think they're trying to reach us. Maybe they were disturbed when the morgue was built, or maybe it's something else entirely. But whatever it is, it's ancient, and it's angry." Rachel's mind raced. It made sense in a horrifying way. The whispers, the strange occurrences, the feeling of being watched, it all pointed to something beyond their understanding. Something that had been waiting, festering in the shadows, until now. "What do we do?" Rachel asked, her voice barely a whisper. Emily looked at her, fear etched in her features. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice hollow. "But I don't think we can just ignore it. It's getting worse, Rachel. I can feel it. Whatever's happening, it's not going to stop." Just as she spoke, the lights in the apartment flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness before snapping back on. Both women froze, their eyes darting around the room, their hearts pounding in unison. The whispers began again, louder this time, more urgent, like a chorus of voices rising from the depths of the earth. "Rachel, Emily." The voices twisted their names, distorting them into something unrecognizable, something malevolent. Rachel's hands gripped the edge of the couch, her knuckles turning white. Emily stood up, her eyes wide with terror. "I don't think we're alone," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that both women could see their breath in the air. The whispers intensified, swirling around them, filling the apartment with an oppressive weight. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she felt the unmistakable presence of something in the room with them. Emily's phone buzzed in her hand, and she glanced down at the screen. Her eyes widened, and her face drained of color. "Rachel," she whispered, holding out the phone. Rachel took it, her hands shaking. The screen displayed a series of text messages, all from Thomas. But it wasn't the content of the messages that made her blood run cold. It was the timestamp. Each message had been sent after Thomas's death. "They're coming for you too." Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she read the last message. She looked up at Emily, her heart pounding in her ears. And then, the lights went out. The apartment was plunged into an almost suffocating darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of Emily's phone screen. The oppressive blackness seemed to wrap around Rachel and Emily like a shroud, thick and unnatural, as if the very air had become a living entity pressing in on them. The whispers grew louder, rising in intensity, swirling in the cold air as if they were all around them, closing in. "Rachel, Emily." The sound of their names twisted in the air, dripping with malice, distorted and overlapping, as if dozens of voices were speaking at once, each one echoing from the walls, the floors, the very foundation of the building. Rachel's breath came in short, shallow gasps, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She reached for Emily's hand, gripping it tightly, both of them frozen in terror as they listened to the whispers circle closer. "What do we do?" Emily's voice was barely audible, trembling with fear. She clung to Rachel as if letting go would mean slipping into the void that now seemed to surround them. The cold seeped into their bones, each breath visible in the icy air. "I don't know," Rachel whispered, her voice shaking as she scanned the pitch-black room. Her mind raced, but there was no logic that could explain what was happening. The darkness was alive. It was watching them, and she could feel the malevolent presence creeping ever closer. "We can't stay here. We have to leave. Now!" Just as she spoke, a loud thud reverberated through the apartment, the sound coming from the far corner of the living room. It was a heavy, wet sound like something large and rotting hitting the floor. Both women gasped, turning toward the source of the noise, though they could see nothing in the overwhelming darkness. Another thud, this time closer. Rachel's heart nearly stopped. She fumbled for her phone in her pocket, the small beam of light from the screen illuminating only a sliver of the room. But what she saw made her blood run cold. There, in the dim glow, was the unmistakable silhouette of a figure standing in the corner. Its outline was barely visible, but she could make out the black robes draping over a skeletal frame, its face obscured beneath a hood. It was one of them, the same figure she had seen in the morgue, the same figure from her nightmares. The shadowy form loomed, unmoving, watching them. Rachel's grip tightened on Emily's hand, and she barely managed to whisper, "Do you see that?" Emily's eyes followed Rachel's gaze, and when she saw the figure, her breath caught in her throat. She nodded shakily, too terrified to speak. The figure didn't move at first. It stood in the corner, silent, as if waiting for something. And then, slowly, it began to raise its hand. The movement was deliberate, almost languid, as the skeletal hand extended toward them, bony fingers curling in the air. The whispers rose in pitch, the voices now distinct, each one seeming to chant something ancient, something forbidden. Rachel's mind screamed for her to run, but her body was frozen, her legs numb with terror. The figure stepped forward, its footsteps impossibly silent as it glided toward them. The blackness seemed to swallow everything in its path, devouring the room as it advanced. "We have to go," Rachel finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. She pulled Emily to her feet, her mind racing. They stumbled toward the front door, but every step felt like they were moving through quicksand, as if the shadows themselves were trying to drag them back. The whispers intensified, filling their ears, their minds. The figures were speaking directly to them now, their voices low and menacing. "You cannot escape. This place is ours." Just as they reached the door, the air grew colder still, and Rachel's hand faltered on the doorknob. The sensation of being watched grew, so strong it felt as though eyes were burning into her back, and she risked a glance behind her. What she saw nearly made her scream. The figure from the corner was no longer alone. Dozens more had appeared in the apartment, each one a dark, skeletal form wrapped in tattered robes. They stood in the shadows, lining the walls, motionless except for the faint undulations of their hoods, as if they were breathing, watching, waiting. Their eyes, if they even had eyes, were hidden, but Rachel could feel their hollow gaze piercing through her, draining the warmth from her soul. She turned back to the door, her hands shaking violently as she fumbled with the lock. "Emily, help me," she whispered urgently, trying to force the door open, but her fingers felt like ice, clumsy and uncooperative. Emily was by her side in an instant, tugging at the doorknob with her, both of them desperate to escape the nightmare closing in around them. Suddenly, a loud creak echoed through the apartment, like the groan of ancient wood under immense pressure. The entire building seemed to tremble for a moment, as if reacting to the presence of the shadowy figures, before a new sound emerged. It was low at first, a dull rumble, like something being dragged through the walls. And then it grew, becoming a deafening cacophony that rattled the windows and shook the floor beneath their feet. And then the whispers stopped. The abrupt silence was more terrifying than the noise. Rachel and Emily froze, the door still locked, their breath coming in shallow gasps as they waited for whatever was coming next. In the stillness, a soft tapping began. Rachel's blood ran cold as she realized it wasn't coming from inside the apartment. It was coming from outside, beyond the door. The tapping was slow, methodical, as though something or someone was waiting on the other side. Each tap reverberated through her bones, filling her with a paralyzing dread. "Do we open it?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Rachel shook her head violently. "No," she hissed. "We can't." But the tapping continued, insistent, growing louder with each knock. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped, replaced by the soft creak of the door slowly, impossibly, unlocking itself. The doorknob turned. Rachel's heart leaped into her throat as the door swung open, revealing nothing but the dark hallway beyond. The figures inside the apartment remained motionless, their skeletal forms still as statues, but the air was thick with anticipation, as if the very building was holding its breath. Rachel could feel it, the presence from beyond the door. Something was waiting for them out there in the darkness, something worse than the figures inside. Emily grabbed Rachel's arm, her grip painfully tight. "We can't stay here," she whispered urgently. "We have to go." With no other choice, Rachel nodded, and together they stepped into the hallway. The door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the empty corridor like the final nail in a coffin. But the whispers had followed them. The hallway stretched out before them like an endless tunnel of darkness, its oppressive silence broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above, some flickering like they were on the verge of burning out. Rachel and Emily stood frozen for a moment, their breath shallow, their senses on high alert. The slam of the apartment door still echoed in their minds, but it was the unmistakable feeling of the presence lurking just beyond sight that gripped them with terror. Rachel glanced behind her, half expecting the figures to be following them, but the door remained closed, the skeletal-robed forms still trapped inside. Yet, the whispers had followed. Faint, barely audible, they clung to the edges of her consciousness, threatening to drag her back into their depths. The air was thick, stifling, as though the walls themselves were alive and breathing with malevolent intent. "We need to get out of here," Rachel whispered, her voice shaking, her hand gripping Emily's arm. The corridor stretched ahead, each step forward feeling like a gamble, as if the darkness itself might reach out and consume them. Emily nodded, though the fear in her eyes was palpable. She hadn't spoken since they'd left the apartment, her body trembling with the same bone-deep terror that gripped Rachel. Together, they moved forward, their footsteps slow and deliberate, echoing unervingly in the narrow hallway. But something was wrong. With each step, the hallway seemed to stretch further, elongating in a way that defied reason. No matter how far they walked, the exit at the far end seemed to retreat, distant and unreachable, as though the building itself was trapping them in an infinite loop. Rachel stopped suddenly, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel it again, that suffocating presence, the thing that had been waiting for them, lurking beyond the door. Only now it was closer. Her skin prickled, her body going rigid as her senses screamed at her to run. But there was nowhere to go. She turned to Emily, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you feel it?" Emily's eyes were wide with terror. "It's behind us." Slowly, as if drawn by an unseen force, Rachel turned her head to look back down the hallway. The shadows flickered unnaturally, the lights above dimming for just a moment. And then she saw it. At the far end of the hall, where the apartment doors lined the walls, stood a figure. It was different from the robed ones in the apartment. This one was taller, its shape more defined, its outline sharper. It was draped in black, but there was something sickeningly human about its form, though twisted and wrong. Its head was slightly tilted, as if studying them, and where its face should have been, there was only an empty void of darkness. But it was the eyes, or rather, the lack of them, that made Rachel's blood run cold. From within that void, she could feel it staring at her, as though its very gaze was stripping away layers of her soul. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, swirling around her head, their words distorted and broken, but unmistakably calling her name. "Rachel! Emily! Join us!" The figure moved forward, gliding silently down the hallway toward them, its presence warping the air around it. The walls seemed to bow inward, like they were bending to its will, the floor shifting beneath their feet. Rachel could feel her grip on reality slipping, her mind unraveling under the weight of its gaze. "We have to move," she cried, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her forward. They ran, their footsteps loud and frantic against the linoleum floor, but no matter how fast they moved, the hallway stretched endlessly ahead of them. The exit remained out of reach, and the figure behind them was closing in, its pace slow but deliberate, as if it knew they had no escape. Emily stumbled, nearly falling as they rounded a corner, but Rachel yanked her upright, adrenaline surging through her veins. "Keep going," she urged, her voice panicked. The whispers were everywhere now, deafening, rising and falling like a twisted symphony of voices all competing for dominance. "You can't escape. You belong here." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, her lungs burning as they sprinted down yet another endless corridor. Every door they passed seemed to shimmer and distort, and the walls themselves pulsed, as if the building were a living entity feeding off their fear. The figure was getting closer, the air growing colder with every step it took. And then, in the distance, Rachel saw something. A door, slightly ajar, with a dim light spilling out into the hallway. It was the first sign of hope they had seen since leaving the apartment. Without thinking, she dragged Emily toward it, their only chance of escape. They burst through the door, slamming it shut behind them, both of them gasping for breath. The room they had entered was small, dimly lit by a flickering fluorescent light in the ceiling. It looked like a storage room. Metal shelves lined the walls, filled with old, rusted tools and forgotten boxes. But the room had a different air to it, one that felt slightly removed from the horrors outside. The whispers were quieter here, almost distant, as if whatever malevolent force had been chasing them couldn't quite reach them in this space. For a brief moment, Rachel allowed herself to hope. Maybe they had found a sanctuary, a place to hide from the nightmare that stalked them. But that hope was short-lived. Emily's face was pale, her eyes wide as she stared at something behind Rachel. "Rachel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Look." Rachel turned slowly, her body trembling. At the far end of the room, where the dim light cast long, eerie shadows, stood another figure. This one was smaller, but no less terrifying. Its body was hunched, cloaked in rags that clung to its skeletal frame. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but from the darkness within, Rachel could hear it breathing, a slow, labored sound that sent chills down her spine. The whispers grew louder, more distinct now. They weren't just in her head anymore. They were coming from it. "You can't hide from us. We've been waiting for you." Rachel's legs buckled, and she backed away, her body trembling uncontrollably. She had no more strength left to run, no more fight in her. Whatever this thing was, it had found them. It had been waiting for them all along. The room grew colder, the air thickening with the weight of impending doom. Rachel could feel it closing in, the same darkness that had consumed the hallway, the apartment, the morgue. It was everywhere. There was no escaping it. Emily's hand slipped into hers, squeezing it tightly, as if holding on to the last thread of hope. But Rachel knew there was no escape. Not anymore. They had been marked from the moment they stepped foot into the Necropolis, drawn into its cursed grasp. The whispers swirled around them, louder, more insistent, drowning out all other sounds. And then, from the figure in the corner, a final whisper cut through the chaos, clear and undeniable. "Welcome home." The lights flickered one last time and went out,